The day he left, he put his key on the counter and said, "Let's see how long you last without my paycheck." I didn't say a word. 2 years later, Architectural Digest featured my home on their cover. 4,200 square feet. Waterfront. Paid in full. He texted me 11 minutes after the issue dropped. I never opened it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the woman standing in a one-bedroom apartment in Beaufort, South Carolina, holding a divorce decree in one hand and a cup of cold coffee in the other, wondering how she'd ended up here. My name is Colette Marchetti, and 2 years ago, I was what most people would call a failure. 34 years old. No savings to speak of. No property. A 9-year marriage that ended with a single sentence and a house key sliding across a granite countertop like he was returning a library book. The man I'd built a life with, Trent Harlow, looked at me the way you look at an expired coupon. Something that once had value, but didn't anymore. Something you toss into the trash, without a second glance. "You gave up your career for what?" he'd said during our last real argument, 3 weeks before he walked out. We were standing in the kitchen of our rented townhouse on Ladies Island, the one with the leaky faucet he never fixed and the magnolia tree in the backyard that dropped waxy leaves onto the patio every fall. To play with old wood and rusty nails? Old wood and rusty nails. That's what he called it. What I called it was architectural preservation, the painstaking, deeply specialized art of saving structures that most people had already given up on. Buildings that the world had written off as too far gone, too expensive, too broken to be worth the trouble. But Trent never understood that. To him, my work was a hobby at best, an embarrassment at worst. He was a regional sales director for a medical device company called Orthovantage, pulling in $210,000 a year with bonuses, and he never, not once in 9 years, let me forget that his paycheck kept the lights on while I was out, in his words, playing carpenter. And honestly, for a long time, I believed him. See, that's the thing people don't tell you about emotional erosion. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't arrive like a hurricane with warning sirens and evacuation orders. It happens one comment at a time. One eye roll at a dinner party, when someone asks what you do for a living. One, "Well, Colette doesn't really work," dropped casually in front of his college friends over craft beer at Saltus River Grill downtown. One Christmas where his mother, Diane, handed me a self-help book called Finding Your Purpose After 30 and said, "I just thought it might help, sweetie," while the rest of the family pretended to be very interested in their pecan pie. 9 years of that will reshape you. Like water wearing down limestone. You don't even realize you've been carved into something smaller, something quieter, something that takes up less space in a room, until one day you catch your reflection in a window and barely recognize the woman staring back. She looks tired. She looks apologetic. She looks like someone who's been holding her breath for a decade, waiting for permission to exhale. That was me. That was exactly who I was the day Trent put his key on the counter. But I need to tell you about the house. Because the house is where everything changed. And if you think this is just a story about a woman and her ex-husband, you're wrong. This is a story about a house that refused to die, and the woman who understood why it shouldn't have to. It was a place called the Verdier Cottage, though cottage was generous. It sat on a half-acre lot on the banks of the Beaufort River, about 4 miles south of the historic district, down a dirt road that tourists never found and locals had mostly forgotten. Built in 1847, Federal-style architecture with a double-gallery porch that had partially collapsed sometime in the 1990s. The roof was half gone. You could stand in the upstairs hallway and see clouds drifting overhead like the house was an open-air cathedral. The foundation was sinking on the east side, pulling the whole structure into a slow, graceful lean toward the water. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks around it like curtains around a deathbed. Most people drove past it, if they drove past it at all, and saw a teardown. A liability. A place where teenagers probably went to smoke and scare each other. I drove past it and saw bones. Good bones. The kind of bones that make a preservation architect's heart beat faster. Heart pine floors under the rot. Wide plank, old-growth longleaf pine that you literally cannot buy anymore because the trees it came from take 300 years to mature, and we cut them all down a century ago. Original plaster medallions on the ceilings, hand-sculpted with acanthus leaf patterns so delicate they looked like lace frozen in time. Hand-forged iron hardware on the doors. Not the mass-produced stuff from a catalog, but individual pieces made by a blacksmith who signed his work with a tiny anvil stamp on each hinge plate. And a fireplace mantle in the main parlor carved from a single piece of black walnut that was so beautiful it made my chest ache the first time I touched it. I remember the texture, smooth as river stone, warm even in the January cold, with a grain pattern that swirled like fingerprints. I first noticed the Verdier cottage during my marriage back when I was doing small preservation consulting jobs on the side, documenting historical properties for the Beaufort County Archives, advising on paint colors for a few homes in the Point neighborhood, writing condition reports that nobody but me would ever read. Nothing that paid much. Certainly nothing Trent respected. But the work kept a part of me alive that his indifference was trying to suffocate. And I kept a file on the cottage. A thick manila folder that I hid in the bottom drawer of my desk, underneath fabric swatches and old sketches, where Trent would never look because Trent never once looked in my desk. It contained photos I'd taken through the broken windows on Sunday mornings while he slept off Saturday night football parties. Research I'd done at the Beaufort District Collection Library during my lunch breaks. Photocopies of property transfer records from the 1800s. I knew the home's entire lineage, built by a merchant named Absalom Verdier, passed through 4 families, served briefly as a freedmen's school after the Civil War, fell into disrepair in the 1940s, was condemned in 2003. The county owned it. Nobody wanted it. It sat there on the riverbank, sinking and silent, like it was waiting for someone. I know that sounds romantic. Maybe it is. But here's the thing about old houses, they don't lie. They can't pretend to be something they're not. Every crack tells you exactly what went wrong and when. Every layer of paint is a chapter. Every repair and every neglect is written into the structure like a diary. And I had spent my entire adult life learning to read that diary. After Trent left, I moved into a rented apartment above a bait shop on Bay Street. The place smelled like shrimp and motor oil, and the floors tilted slightly toward the river so that if you dropped a marble in the kitchen, it would roll all the way to the bathroom door. I had $4,300 in a personal savings account Trent didn't know about. Money I'd squirreled away from my consulting work over the years, $20 and $50 at a time, like a woman in the 1940s hiding bills inside a coffee can behind the flour. The apartment cost $875 a month. I had 5 months of breathing room if I ate cheap and didn't get sick. But here's what Trent also didn't know, what nobody in his family knew, what even Margot didn't fully know yet. I'd been quietly building something during those 9 years of silence. See, during all that time, while Trent thought I was playing with old wood and rusty nails, while his mother was gifting me self-help books, while his sister Kendra was asking me at Thanksgiving dinners when I planned to get a real job, during all of that, I had been completing my certification through the National Trust for Historic Preservation's advanced program. I'd published 3 peer-reviewed papers in the Journal of Architectural Conservation. I'd developed a proprietary technique for stabilizing original horsehair plaster using a modified lime putty formula mixed with casein binder that prevented the cracking and separation that destroys most 19th century plasterwork. And 2 universities, the College of Charleston and Clemson's graduate program in historic preservation, had cited my technique in their coursework. And here's the one that still gets me. I'd earned my architecture license. Full licensure. 3 years into my marriage. Trent was at a sales conference in Orlando, pitching me replacement hardware to orthopedic surgeons at a Hilton ballroom. I drove to Columbia, sat for the R exam, the architect registration examination, 7 divisions, months of preparation, passed on my first attempt, and drove home the same day. I framed the license and kept it in the bottom drawer of my desk, right next to the Verdier cottage file, underneath a stack of old sketches. Some women hide jewelry. I hid credentials. Why didn't I tell him? That's the question I've asked myself 1,000 times. And the honest answer, the one that still makes me wince, is that I was afraid. Not of his anger. Trent was never angry. He was something worse. Dismissive. He'd find a way to make it small. He'd say, "That's great, babe," in the same tone he'd use if I told him I'd finished a jigsaw puzzle. He'd call it cute. He'd ask when I planned to do something with it. And I wasn't strong enough yet to hear that without believing it. So I hid it, like a seed you bury in winter, because you know the soil isn't ready. But that's the thing about leaving someone who diminishes you. The absence of their voice creates space. And in that space, in that small, shrimp-scented apartment above the bait shop, you start to hear your own voice again. Faintly at first, like a radio signal coming back after a long drive through the mountains. Now let me tell you about Margot Solis, because without her, this story goes a very different direction. Margot ran a boutique historic preservation firm out of Charleston called Solis and Strand. She specialized in saving what she called endangered architecture, antebellum homes, Reconstruction-era churches, Gullah community structures along the Sea Islands, the buildings that developers wanted to demolish and replace with luxury condos or resort hotels. She was 52, silver-haired, wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had a laugh that could fill a courtroom. She'd seen my published work in the Conservation Journal, attended a talk I gave at a Preservation Alliance conference in Savannah, a talk Trent didn't know I'd given because I told him I was visiting a college friend in Hilton Head, and she'd reached out about a year before my divorce. We'd had coffee at a cafe on King Street in Charleston. She ordered a Cortadou. I ordered Black Drip because I was embarrassed to spend money on anything fancier. She looked at my portfolio, photographs, condition reports, technical drawings, and she said something I'll never forget. "Colette, you have one of the best eyes for federal period restoration I've ever encountered. And I've been doing this for 26 years. When you're ready to do something bigger, call me." I wasn't ready then. Trent's voice was still louder in my head than my own. But 3 months after he left, after the bait shop apartment and the cold coffee and the divorce decree and 5 weeks of crying in the shower, so my downstairs neighbor, an elderly crabber named Mr. Gadsden, wouldn't hear, I called her. "I have a property," I told her. My hands were shaking. I was sitting on the tilted kitchen floor with my back against the refrigerator. The Verdier Cottage in Beaufort. It's condemned, county-owned, and falling apart. But the bones are extraordinary, Margot. The bones are some of the best I've ever seen. There was a pause on the line. Then Margot laughed. Not at me. Never at me with me. The way someone laughs when they've been waiting for a phone call they knew was coming. The way a gardener laughs when the seed finally cracks through the soil. "Tell me everything," she said. Now here's where I need to pause and explain something because most people have no idea how historic preservation funding actually works, and understanding this is crucial to understanding what happened next. You don't just walk into a bank and say, "I'd like to buy a condemned house, please." Banks don't lend on condemned properties. Insurance companies won't touch them. Conventional financing doesn't exist for a building the county has declared unfit for human habitation. But there are other paths. Federal historic tax credits, a 20% tax credit on qualified rehabilitation expenses for income-producing properties listed on the National Register. State preservation grants through the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Private foundation money from organizations like the Preservation Society of Charleston, the Historic Savannah Foundation, the National Trust's own grant programs. But every single one of these funding sources requires documentation so detailed and meticulous it would make a tax attorney weep. Architectural surveys with measurements down to the quarter inch. Historical significance assessments, citing primary sources. Preservation plans that run hundreds of pages, specifying everything from the type of lime morite to be used in repointing brick to the species of wood acceptable for replacing damaged sills. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of work I'd been training to do for a decade, while my husband thought I was wasting my time. Margot and I formed a partnership. She provided the business infrastructure, Solis and Strand's established 501(c)(3) preservation arm, which allowed us to receive grants and tax-deductible donations. She provided the contractor network, craftsmen and tradespeople across the Lowcountry who specialized in historic work. And she provided some seed capital from the firm's revolving preservation fund, $85,000 to cover acquisition and initial stabilization costs. I provided the preservation expertise, the architectural vision, the 700-page preservation plan that I wrote over 6 weeks, working 18-hour days in my bait shop apartment, surrounded by research binders and technical drawings pinned to every wall. And I provided something money can't buy, an intimate, almost obsessive knowledge of the Verdier cottage that I'd been accumulating for 7 years. I knew every beam, every molding profile, every species of wood in that house by the grain pattern alone. I could have drawn the floor plan from memory in my sleep. I probably did, more than once. We acquired the property from Beaufort County for $38,000, essentially the value of the land minus the demolition costs the county was delighted to avoid. Then we applied for and received a $420,000 federal historic preservation grant through the National Park Service's Historic Preservation Fund. Then a $175,000 grant from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Then a private donation of $90,000 from a preservation foundation in Savannah that had been watching the Verdier cottage for years, hoping, praying, really, that someone qualified would step up to save it. Then additional funds from 2 smaller foundations and a community crowdfunding campaign that Margot organized through Solis and Strands Network. Total project budget, $1.2 million. For a property everyone said was worthless. For a house that should have been demolished. And I was the lead preservation architect. The one whose name was on every plan, every permit, every grant application. The one who would stand or fall with this project. How do you think that felt? After 9 years of being told I was wasting my time? After 9 years of being the woman who didn't really work? I'll tell you how it felt. Terrifying. Because the voice in my head that said I could do this was still quieter than the one that said I'd fail. And that second voice sounded exactly like Trent. The restoration of the Verdier cottage took 14 months. I won't walk you through every week, but I want you to understand the scope, the sheer, relentless physicality of bringing a condemned building back to life. We stabilized the foundation using a helical pier system, 23 steel piers drilled down through the sandy low-country soil to hit load-bearing strata. Each one had to be placed within inches of the calculated position. One wrong pier could shift the stress load and crack the very walls we were trying to save. We rebuilt the double-gallery porch using reclaimed heart pine that I personally sourced from a demolished cotton warehouse in Georgetown, 60 miles up the coast. I drove there on a Tuesday morning in a borrowed pickup truck, spent 7 hours pulling boards from the wreckage while the demolition crew waited, loaded 1,400 pounds of lumber into the truck bed, and drove home in the dark with my headlights barely cutting through the fog rolling off the Waccamaw River. My arms were so sore the next morning I couldn't lift a coffee cup. But those boards, that old-growth longleaf pine, dense and amber-colored, with a ring count so tight you needed a magnifying glass to see them, those boards were now part of the Verdier cottage's porch. 2 centuries of Southern history joined together. That's not a metaphor. That's wood. I spent 3 weeks, 21 consecutive days, working 10 to 14 hours each, hand-repairing the plaster ceiling medallion in the front parlor. The medallion was 4 feet in diameter, a riot of acanthus leaves and rosettes that had been sculpted by hand in 1847. A quarter of it had crumbled away. I mixed lime putty by hand, hydrated lime, marble dust, animal hair fiber binder, using the technique I developed and published. I used dental tools, actual dental picks and scrapers, purchased in bulk from a supply catalog, to recreate the acanthus leaf patterns, matching the pressure and curve of the original sculptor's hand as closely as I could by studying the surviving sections under magnification. I remember the smell of that lime putty, cool and chalky, like wet stone after rain. I remember the sound the house made as we brought the foundation back to level, quiet groans and sighs, like something old stretching after a very long sleep. Creaks you could feel in your chest. I remember standing on the rebuilt porch one evening in October, taking a break, watching the Beaufort River turn copper and gold through the live oaks as the sun went down, and thinking, this is what I was always supposed to do. This is what Trent couldn't see. Not because it was hidden, but because he never once looked. Now, during all of this, I had almost no contact with Trent or his family. The divorce had been clean and quick, no children, no shared property worth fighting over, since the townhouse we'd rented was in his name, and he kept everything in it. Everything. The furniture we'd picked together. The kitchen table where I'd studied for my licensing exam after he fell asleep. The bookshelf I'd built by hand from salvaged cypress. I walked away with my clothes, my books, my drafting tools, my professional files, and my self-respect, or what was left of it. But Trent's mother, Diane, had opinions. She always had opinions. Diane Harlow was the kind of woman who could make, bless your heart, sound like a death sentence. She'd been a homemaker her entire adult life, married Trent's father, Bud, at 21, raised 3 children, volunteered at St. Helena's Episcopal Church, and ran the Harlow household like a benevolent dictatorship where the benevolence was mostly for show. She had strong views on what women should and shouldn't do, and crawling around in condemned buildings fell firmly in the shouldn't category. About 4 months into the restoration, I ran into her at the Piggly Wiggly on Boundary Street. I was buying supplies for the work crew, sandwich bread, deli meat, a flat of bottled water, because when you're running a construction site, feeding people is part of the job. Diane was in the wine aisle, examining a bottle of Kendall Jackson like it contained state secrets. She saw me before I could turn around. "Colette," she said, in that honeyed drawl that could curdle milk. "Well, aren't you a sight? I heard you bought some old shack out by the river." Trent mentioned it. She said Trent's name the way you'd say the name of a saint, reverently, protectively, like even mentioning him in my presence was a generosity. "It's a historic home," I said. My voice was steady, but I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. "Federal style, built in 1847. I'm restoring it." She tilted her head. That tilt. Lord, that tilt. The one that said, "Oh, bless your heart," without her lips moving. The one that made you feel 6 inches shorter. "Well," she said, placing the Kendall Jackson in her cart with 2 fingers like it was a gavel, "I do hope you have a backup plan. Trent always said you were better at starting things than finishing them." She paused, then added almost gently, "I just wouldn't want to see you embarrass yourself, sweetie." I felt the old familiar sting. That heat behind my eyes. The shrinking. The impulse to apologize for existing in a way that inconvenienced her worldview. But then I thought about the plaster medallion. About the 23 piers holding that house steady in the earth. About the heart pine I'd carried 60 miles in a borrowed truck. About the way the grain glowed when the morning light hit it through the restored 9/9 windows. 12 panes of hand-blown reproduction glass that I'd ordered from a glassmaker in West Virginia, who was one of the last people in America still making them by the traditional cylinder method. "I'll manage, Diane," I said. And I walked away. No clever comeback. No devastating one-liner. Just a woman with lime dust under her fingernails and sawdust in her hair, pushing a cart full of sandwich supplies toward the checkout. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to perform strength. Sometimes you just walk away and let your work speak later. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming, least of all me. And if you think this is just going to be a straightforward revenge story, I promise you it's not. What happened next changed not just the project, but the way I understood the house and the way I understood myself. About 10 months into the restoration, during the final phase of interior work, I discovered something in the house. Specifically, inside a sealed compartment behind the black walnut fireplace mantel in the main parlor. The mantel that had made my chest ache the first time I touched it, years ago, through a broken window. When we carefully removed the mantel for restoration, a process that took 2 full days because I refused to damage the wood, insisting on dissolving the 170-year-old hide glue with a controlled steam application rather than prying, we found a cavity in the brick chimney stack. It had been deliberately sealed with lime mortar that matched the original construction. Someone had hidden something inside the wall in 1847 and made sure no one would find it casually. Inside was a leather portfolio, dry and remarkably well-preserved. The sealed brick cavity had maintained a stable temperature and humidity for nearly 2 centuries. Inside the portfolio were 14 hand-drawn architectural plans on heavy cotton rag paper. The drawings were precise, detailed, and beautiful. Floor plans, elevation drawings, structural details, ornamental specifications. They were the original 1847 plans for the Verdier cottage. And they were signed by a free black architect named Jonas Beaumont. Let me explain why this matters, because if you don't know the history, you won't understand why I sat down on the dusty parlor floor and cried. In antebellum South Carolina, free black craftsmen, builders, and yes, architects existed, but they were rarely credited for their work. Their designs were attributed to white property owners, white builders, or simply listed as anonymous in the historical record. Finding original signed architectural plans by a named free black architect from 1847 with his full name, his designation as architect and master builder, and detailed annotations in his own hand was not just unusual. It was historically significant. The kind of significant that makes historians at major universities set down their coffee cups and call their colleagues. I contacted Dr. Emmeline Page at the College of Charleston, a professor I'd met at a preservation conference 2 years earlier. She specialized in African American architectural history in the Lowcountry, specifically the contributions of enslaved and free black craftsmen to Southern built heritage. When I emailed her photographs of the plans, she called me within 20 minutes. When she arrived in Beaufort and saw the originals, spread out on a clean linen sheet on the restored parlor floor, wearing cotton gloves, a magnifying lamp casting warm light across the drafting lines, she went quiet for almost a full minute. Then she said, very softly, almost reverently, "Colette, do you understand what you've found?" The plans were authenticated through paper analysis, ink dating, and comparison with known free black builder documents from the period. They were donated, at my insistence and with Margot's full support, to the Beaufort History Museum, with full documentation and archival framing. Dr. Page published a groundbreaking paper on the discovery in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians, naming me and the Verdier Cottage restoration as the catalyst. The story was picked up by the Post and Courier in Charleston, then by the Associated Press Wire, then by the Smithsonian Magazine's online edition. A free black man designed a house in 1847. He signed his work. He hid his plans inside a wall, knowing that in his lifetime he would never receive credit. And 170 years later, a woman who'd been told her own work was worthless found them. If you don't think the universe has a sense of narrative structure, I don't know what to tell you. And here's where the second unexpected turn comes in, because the discovery caught the attention of someone who was already paying attention. A journalist from Architectural Digest named Priya Nair had reached out to Margot months earlier. Priya covered Southern architecture and historic preservation, and she'd noticed our project in a National Trust database of active restorations. She'd been planning a modest feature, maybe 2 or 3 pages, about the cottage itself. But when the Jonas Beaumont discovery broke in the regional press, she called Margot and said she wanted to come back. She wanted to rewrite the entire piece. Priya spent 3 days in Beaufort the second time. She photographed everything: the house from the river at dawn, the double gallery porch at golden hour, the restored plaster medallion with light raking across it to show the texture of the new work matching the old. She photographed the Jonas Beaumont plans in their archival cases. She photographed me, covered in sawdust, wearing steel-toed boots and a flannel shirt, standing on the porch I'd rebuilt with reclaimed wood from a cotton warehouse 60 miles away. She interviewed me for 6 hours over 2 days. We sat on the porch and talked about the history of the house, the restoration techniques, the grants, the community response. I told her about the hand-blown glass window panes we'd found buried in the garden soil during excavation, fragments that I'd sent to a glass conservator in Williamsburg for analysis and that turned out to match a known glassworks in Germany. I told her about discovering a child's pencil drawing from the 1870s hidden under 6 layers of wallpaper in an upstairs bedroom, a drawing of a dog with impossibly long legs and a lopsided smile, that we'd framed in archival glass and hung back in the same room where it was drawn. And I told her, without really planning to, without even deciding to, about my divorce. About the man who called my life's work old wood and rusty nails. About the key on the counter. About the bait shop apartment. About the 5 months of breathing room and the secret savings account and the license hidden in a desk drawer. Priya looked at me for a long moment. The light was changing, that particular Lowcountry light that goes amber before it goes pink. She was quiet, which was unusual for her. Then she said, "Colette, this isn't just a restoration story. This is a resurrection story. I didn't fully understand what she meant until 6 months later, when the magazine came out. The issue dropped in March. The Verdier cottage was on the cover. Not mentioned on page 47. Not a sidebar. The cover. A full-bleed photograph of the double-gallery porch at golden hour, the Beaufort River shimmering behind it through the live oaks, the moss swaying in an invisible breeze like the house was breathing. The headline read, "Resurrected, the Beaufort cottage that rewrote history." Inside was a 12-page feature. Photographs of every room, the heart pine floors glowing like honey, the restored 9/9 windows with their hand-blown glass catching prisms in the afternoon light, the plaster medallion I'd repaired with dental tools and lime putty, the black walnut mantel back in its place above the fireplace, the Jonas Beaumont plans displayed in archival frames on the parlor wall, and a 2-page profile of me. Colette Marchetti, preservation architect and lead restorer. The woman who saved a house everyone else had given up on. The article noted that the fully restored Verdier cottage had been appraised at $2.8 million. That the Jonas Beaumont discovery had generated a $350,000 research grant to fund a comprehensive study of free Black architects and builders across the coastal South, a project Dr. Page was leading, with me serving on the advisory board. That I'd been invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Preservation Conference in Washington, D.C. That Solis and Strand had since received inquiries on 11 additional endangered properties across 3 states, South Carolina, Georgia, and North Carolina, directly because of the attention the Verdier project generated. The article did not mention Trent Harlow. It didn't need to. He wasn't part of the story. He'd removed himself from it the day he put his key on the counter. But here's the part you've been waiting for. I know you have. And I'm going to give it to you, but maybe not the way you expect. 11 minutes. That's how long it took. The magazine's digital edition went live at 8 a.m. Eastern on a Tuesday. At 8:11 a.m., my phone buzzed on the mantel. The black walnut mantel, Jonas Beaumont's mantel, the mantel I'd spent 2 days removing and 3 weeks restoring. A text from a number I hadn't deleted, because deleting it felt like giving it a power it didn't deserve. You delete things that threaten you. Trent's number didn't threaten me anymore. Trent. Colette. I just saw AD. We should talk. 7 words. After 2 years of silence. 7 words that managed to be simultaneously a statement, a request, and, if you know how to read Trent Harlow, a confession. I stared at that message for a long time. I read it the way you read something written in a language you used to speak fluently, but have since half forgotten. The words made sense individually, but strung together, they belonged to someone else's life. A different Colette. The one who used to shrink. I didn't open it. By that, I mean I saw the preview on my lock screen, those 7 words, and I let it sit there. I didn't tap on it. I didn't give it the blue check marks of acknowledgement. I didn't give it the dignity of being read. Then I set my phone down on the mantel and went back to work. Because there was always more work. That's the thing about preservation. It's never finished. There's always another building. Always another set of bones that deserve better than a wrecking ball. Here's what Trent never understood about me, and what his mother never understood, and what all the people who looked at me and saw a woman playing with old wood never understood. The work was always the point. Not the magazine cover. Not the appraised value. Not the conference invitations or the grant money or the profile in a glossy publication. The work itself, the patience of it, the precision, the way your hands learn to speak a language that's older than you are, a language of mortise and tenon, of plaster and lath, of wood that remembers being a tree. But this isn't the end of the story. There's one more thing I need to tell you. And it's the part that still keeps me up at night sometimes. Not from anger, not from satisfaction, but from a sadness I wasn't expecting to feel. 3 weeks after the magazine came out, I received a letter. Not a text, not an email. A handwritten letter, on cream-colored stationery with a monogram at the top, delivered to the Verdier cottage by a postal carrier who had to look up the address twice because the cottage hadn't received mail in over 20 years. It was from Diane, Trent's mother. Now, you have to understand, Diane Harlow was not a woman who wrote letters. She was a woman who made pronouncements, who delivered verdicts over sweet tea at her kitchen table and smiled while she did it, the same way a judge smiles before sentencing. A handwritten letter from Diane was so unexpected, so wildly out of character, that when I saw the return address, I actually checked the envelope for anthrax powder. I'm joking, mostly, but I opened it. I stood in the parlor, Jonas Beaumont's parlor, and I read it. It was 2 pages front and back in her careful Palmer method cursive. She'd been taught penmanship at the kind of Southern girls' school that no longer exists, and her handwriting was impeccable. Each letter formed like it was being graded. The ink was blue-black. She'd used a fountain pen. Diane Harlow, writing a letter with a fountain pen. I almost laughed, but the content stopped me cold.
She was sorry.
Not in the vague, self-serving way people are usually sorry. Not, I'm sorry if you felt hurt, which is just a more elegant way of saying, I'm sorry you're so sensitive, and isn't that really your problem? She was specifically sorry. She listed things. The self-help book at Christmas. She called it cruel and small. The backup plan comment at the Piggly Wiggly. She called it unforgivable, though I'm asking you to consider forgiving it anyway. Every Thanksgiving where she'd asked about my real job. Every time she'd introduced me to someone as Trent's wife, and nothing else, as if my identity began and ended at the altar. And then she wrote something that made me sit down on the floor, right there on the restored heart pine. And the floor held me, the way it had held people for almost 200 years. She wrote that she'd once wanted to be an artist. That when she was 22 years old, the year before she married Bud Harlow, she had applied to the Savannah College of Art and Design. She'd wanted to study painting, landscapes, specifically, the low-country marshes at different hours of the day. She had a portfolio of watercolors she'd done in secret, painting at a card table in her parents' garage while they thought she was studying for her secretarial certification. And her own mother-in-law, Bud's mother, Trent's grandmother, a woman named Laureen Harlow who had died before I ever entered the family, had told her it was a foolish dream. Art is what rich girls do when they've already married money, Laureen had said. And Diane had believed it. She'd put the watercolors in a closet. She'd married Bud. She'd spent the next 40 years making sure no other woman in her family dared to dream bigger than she'd been allowed to. I didn't hate your work, Colette, she wrote, and I could see where the ink had thickened, where she'd pressed harder, where maybe her hand was shaking. I hated that you were brave enough to keep doing it when everyone, including me, especially me, told you to stop. I hated you for the courage I didn't have. And I am deeply, specifically ashamed. I sat with that letter for a long time. I sat with it on the porch, my porch, Jonas Beaumont's porch, the porch rebuilt with heart pine from a cotton warehouse in Georgetown, while the egrets fished in the shallows and the Spanish moss swayed in the evening breeze, and the river did what the Beaufort River always does, moved forward unhurried, indifferent to the small dramas of the people who live along its banks. And I felt something I wasn't expecting to feel. Not triumph, not vindication, not the hot, satisfying rush of being proven right. I felt sad for her. Not forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever completely, because some wounds heal but always leave a scar you can feel when the weather changes. But a sadness that settled into my chest like river fog. Because Diane Harlow wasn't a villain. She was a woman who'd had her own dreams beaten out of her so thoroughly, so efficiently, that watching someone else's survive felt like a personal insult.
A rebuke.
Living proof that she could have fought harder and didn't. That doesn't excuse what she did to me. Not one word of it. But it explains it. And sometimes, understanding the why is more important than punishing the what. Here's what I've learned about cruelty. Most of it isn't born from evil. Most of it is born from grief. Grief over the life you didn't get. Grief over the version of yourself you abandoned. Diane's cruelty wasn't about me. It was about a 22-year-old woman with watercolors in a garage who was told her dreams were foolish, and who agreed, and whose agreement calcified, over 4 decades, into gospel. Into gospel she preached to every woman who came close enough to hear it. I wrote her back. One line. On a postcard I bought at the Beaufort History Museum gift shop. A postcard of the Verdier cottage, as it happened, because they'd started selling them after the AD feature. I wrote, "It's not too late, Diane. SCAD has a continuing education program. I don't know if she ever enrolled. I don't know if she ever picked up a paintbrush again. That's not my story to tell, and it's not my responsibility to make sure she tells it. But I hope she did. I hope she paints marshes. The Verdier cottage stands today on the banks of the Beaufort River, solid and upright, its double-gallery porch catching the morning light the same way it did in 1847. Inside, the Jonas Beaumont plans hang in the main parlor in archival frames, protected by UV-filtering museum glass, next to a child's pencil drawing of a long-legged dog that someone loved enough to sketch 150 years ago. I live there now, not in a showpiece, not in a museum, in a home. There are coffee rings on the kitchen counter for my morning mugs, dog hair on the sofa for my hound Mix, Verdier V for short, named after the house that named itself after a merchant who hired a free black architect whose name was almost lost to history. The floorboards creak in the hallway in a specific pattern I've memorized, a long groan, 2 quick pops, then silence, like a sentence that ends mid-thought. The windows rattle when the wind comes off the water from the northeast. It's not perfect. It was never supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be saved.
And it was.
My phone still has Trent's unread message on it. 11 months now. Sometimes, rarely, and usually late at night, when the house is quiet and the river sounds louder than usual, I wonder what he wanted to say. I wonder if "we should talk" was his version of an apology, or his version of wanting credit, or his version of wanting back in, or just his version of wanting to matter in a story that had moved on without him. But mostly I don't wonder at all, because wondering about Trent takes up space. And I've learned, the hard, slow, lime putty under your fingernails way, that space is the most valuable thing a woman can own. Space in your home. Space in your head. Space where someone else's voice used to be, now filled with your own. Here's the truth about people who tell you that you can't. They're not making a prediction. They're making a confession. They're telling you what they believe about themselves. Trent looked at me and saw someone who couldn't survive without his paycheck because he couldn't imagine surviving without the thing that made him feel powerful. Diane looked at me and saw a foolish dreamer because she'd been told her own dreams were foolish, and she'd agreed, and agreement had calcified into gospel, and gospel is a hard thing to unwrite. And me? I looked at a condemned house that everyone said was worthless, a house the county had given up on, a house that was sinking into the river, a house that most people saw as nothing but old wood and rusty nails, and I saw what it could become. Not because I'm special. Not because I'm smarter or braver or more talented than the people who doubted me, but because I'd spent my whole life being told I was worthless, and I'd learned, the hard, slow, painful, beautiful way, that the people who condemn things are almost never the people who understand them. The magazine sits on my coffee table now. I don't look at it often. When I do, I don't see the cover or the headline or the $2.8 million appraised value. I see the plaster medallion I repaired with dental tools and lime putty mixed by hand. I see the heart pine floors that came from a cotton warehouse in Georgetown. I see the 9/9 windows with their hand-blown glass catching prisms of low-country light. I see the fireplace mantel that held a secret for 170 years, waiting patiently, the way only old things know how to wait, for someone who would listen. And I see a woman who was told she'd never last without a man's paycheck, standing on a porch she built with her own 2 hands, watching the river do what rivers have always done, move forward, always forward, carrying everything and holding nothing, patient and relentless and utterly unconcerned with the opinions of anyone standing on the bank. I never opened that text. And I never will. Some messages aren't worth reading. Some houses are worth saving. And some women, the ones they call foolish, the ones they laugh at over Christmas dinner, the ones they leave with a key on the counter and a prediction of failure, some women are just getting started. The Verdier cottage was condemned in 2003. It was resurrected 22 years later. And the woman who saved it? She was never the one who was broken. She was the one who knew how to fix things. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment telling me about a time someone told you that you couldn't, and you proved them wrong. And if you haven't proved them wrong yet, keep going. The house is still standing.
So are you.